I brought this up a little bit on a previous podcast, but I'll dive into it a little bit more. There's one thing that's very interesting, which is the Chinese follow something called the three warfare strategy. And the three warfare strategy, at the core of this, it's to maintain a position of non-war war. And so for people in the West, this idea that war prevails when peace fails. And for China, it's the opposite. China, their three warfare strategy succeeds because it's war disguised as peace. And the whole goal of the Chinese doctrine is to keep the US war switch off. And it's obvious when you think about kind of how we think about in the US, are we at war with China? We're even having this question right now, which is, are we at war or are we not at war? Did World War III start or did it not start? And for them, their whole goal is to maintain the US thinking about that question. Are we at war or are we not at war? And there's really three main components of this. And I want to talk about this because there's psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. These are the three kind of warfare strategies to maintain non-war war. And psychological warfare, good example, cyber espionage. What's happening when this is a perfect example of how they're using it. So they're doing counter espionage. And what are we thinking? We're like, well, what did they steal? Did they have information? Now we're getting nervous. We're second guessing, thinking about what did they get? Other examples of psychological warfare that they're doing in the South China Sea, for example. They are very, very aggressive with their ships, with their on the edge brinksmanship of, let's say there's ships down there, and they will either ram ships, they'll do flybys, all this stuff that is kind of meant to intimidate. And the other side of psychological warfare, the last part that they're very, very commonly doing, and we're going to dive into because they're doing it with the Belt and Road Initiative, is they're getting smaller countries in debt and then manipulating them and changing their opinions or their votes based on the amount of debt that they're in. Then we all know media warfare. There's lots of stuff going on in the media. They got their own, CCTV, and then they've got the fact that they've bought Hollywood, and you can't have Chinese villains in any movies. Really, really effective stuff. The reason I bring that up is we asked this question: are we already at World War III? Right? Are we already at war? And from my opinion, right, we're just fully down the path of being in non-war war with China, and everything they're doing is, in my opinion, it's winning the way that they want to win. I'm interested from your perspective. Do you have any takes on the Chinese intelligence operation here and the impact for where things are going?
So I think there's a temptation to want to label everything. Is this World War III or is this Cold War 2.0?
Or is it something different?
Or is it something different? And I don't think anybody can accurately label it because it is different. It's a different variety of what we've seen in the past, but it's certainly got new aspects that people are unsure on how to label the situation that we're in right now. But just for clarity, the Cold War, a little bit of history there, was mostly the US versus Russia and to a lesser extent China via some other smaller wars, Korea, Vietnam, etc., where you have these East and West supporting different sides of wars. So as you think of history in those terms, your brain immediately goes to Ukraine, right? We're supporting Ukraine.
Yeah,
Ukraine is fighting Russia, but it's a little bit more direct, right? Because in Vietnam, for example, you had the North and South fighting each other. We were supporting one side of Vietnam, and Russia and China was supporting the other side with weapons and money and etc. And the same with Korea. The same exact thing happened with Korea. You had the Chinese supporting a lot of North Korea's efforts in the war, and then the U.S. came and pushed back a lot of those efforts. And I could go on and on with other countries that this has happened with more on a lower scale, but that's history. And what we're seeing right now is almost identical. The only difference I'd say is Russia with Ukraine. I mean, they're directly involved in it right now. So that's a pretty big difference. It's less of a proxy war for Russia. It's a direct war for them. So I think in those terms, it's very tempting to want to say, oh, we're in World War III because of those things. However, World War II, just for clarity, the reason why it was labeled World War II, it's because more than half of all the countries in the world had officially declared war on one another. And once you have that scenario, you're literally in a world war. We don't have that right now. We don't have countries that are that are overtly declaring war on one another. Yes, we have smaller little things, but not more than half of the countries around the world have declared war. That has not happened. So it's pretty tough to say this is World War III. Conversely, it's pretty tough to say this is just Cold War, because it's certainly more than a Cold War of what's going on. And so I'm not answering your question directly, but I do think we're in a situation where we have crossed the Rubicon and in many senses of not being able to go back on a lot of situations we're in. But we're not quite to the scale of a World War III kinetic we're going to end. By the way, I'm going to end this tirade by just making one comment. There's a book out by Ann Jacobson about nuclear war, and don't read it if you are afraid of nuclear war, because it's like,
well, who's not afraid of nuclear war?
Yeah, well, I mean, but the book is even more terrifying, because I'll spoiler alert: nuclear war ends in the end of humanity, or at least we go back to the Stone Age. There's basically no scenario where we have a limited nuclear war. It's just not possible. It would accelerate beyond your wildest imagination. So the reason I bring that up, though, is because the idea that we're going to have a global kinetic war is almost pretty low, because you have so many superpowers and even smaller powers that have nuclear capacity now, that the idea that we would go to that level is unthinkable, because the world would be done. So what are we in right now? I don't know. World War III, Cold War II hybrid? Hard to say.